November 24, 1944.
Northfield, Tinian, and Elyfield, Saipan.
The 21st Bomber Command dispatched 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses toward the Japanese mainland. Brigadier General H. Wood Hansel directed the American Strategic Bombing Force from his headquarters on Guam. Sleek bombers carried 277 tons of ordnance targeting the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine facility on the outskirts of Tokyo. What Japanese fighter pilots encountered this morning would upend their understanding of aerial combat and expose a technological gap that no amount of bravery or skill could bridge. Captain Tatsuo Yamada adjusted his oxygen mask in the cockpit of his Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien at Chofu Airfield near Tokyo. The morning briefing stressed intercepting enemy bombers while maintaining maximum altitude advantage. Intelligence indicated large four-engine bombers operating from recently captured Mariana Islands bases, flying at altitudes never previously seen. Yamada volunteered for the high-altitude interception mission, a daunting challenge against an adversary whose capabilities remained largely unknown. His aircraft was armed with four 12.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, weapons optimized for combat at conventional altitudes where Japanese fighters had excelled. The altitude challenge arose from Japan's limited experience against American heavy bombers in China earlier in 1944. Those B-24 Liberators and older B-17 Flying Fortresses operated at altitudes within reach of Japanese fighters, typically 20,000 to 25,000 feet. Major T-Shirt Meta had devised specialized climbing tactics from those engagements, emphasizing reaching altitude before combat rather than climbing while fighting. A pilot already at high altitude held energy advantages that could overcome defensive armor. But the morning's intelligence suggested these new bombers flew far higher than anything previously encountered. The 21st Bomber Command represented America's most potent strategic deployment in the Pacific since the Doolittle Raid of 1942. The command would eventually field over 1,000 aircraft across 5 major airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, featuring pressurized cabins specifically designed for extreme high-altitude operations across the vast Pacific. This approach marked a significant departure from previous American bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator had unpressurized crew compartments requiring heavy flight suits and oxygen masks, limiting effective operational ceilings to around 25,000 feet. Designers prioritized altitude capability in the B-29, trading complexity for operational sanctuary above enemy interceptors. Pressurization allowed crews to operate in shirt sleeves at altitudes that would incapacitate unpressurized crews with cold and hypoxia. Yamada's formation included Ki-61s from the 244th Sentai and Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki interceptors from the 47th Sentai, climbing from multiple airfields around Tokyo at their maximum sustainable rate. Japanese pilots observed contrails forming at extreme altitudes as American formations approached from the southeast. Radar operators at the Chiba Detection Station identified the incoming formation between 27,000 and 31,000 feet, varying altitude to navigate weather conditions. Ground controllers vectored defending fighters toward the threat axis, but the climbing interceptors struggled to reach even 25,000 feet before the bombers arrived over the target. The technological disparity was immediately evident as opposing forces attempted engagement. Yamada piloted an aircraft designed in 1941 for medium-altitude combat against Chinese and early Pacific War adversaries. His Ki-61 weighed 7,650 pounds with a 1,175 horsepower Kawasaki Ha-40 liquid-cooled engine, capable of 368 miles per hour at 16,400 feet. Although specifications listed a service ceiling of 36,000 feet, actual performance deteriorated above 28,000 feet. The engine lost power dramatically in thin air, and control surfaces became sluggish. Armor and self-sealing fuel tanks added weight that further reduced altitude performance. The Ki-44 interceptors attempted to reach the bomber formation, which varied between 27,000 and 30,000 feet depending on conditions. Despite being designed for high-altitude interception with superior climb rates, the thin atmosphere hampered engines and pilots struggled with inadequate oxygen systems meant for shorter, lower-altitude missions. Few fighters achieved sufficient altitude, and those that did lacked energy for sustained engagement. Control surfaces responded sluggishly, engines strained beyond design limits, and the B-29s maintained formation at their operational altitude. Crews worked comfortably in pressurized compartments without heavy suits or cumbersome masks. Captain Robert Morgan commanded the lead Superfortress Dauntless Doi as navigator. Captain Theodore Van Kirk identified the primary target through the Norden bombsight. Each bomber's 4 Wright or 3350 engines produced 2,200 horsepower, maintaining over 300 miles per hour true airspeed at operational altitude. Turbo superchargers compressed the thin air, sustaining engine performance where naturally aspirated engines would fail. Pressurized compartments allowed crew movement across the bomb bay tunnel without altitude suits,
enabling extended operations at previously unreachable heights. The Central Fire Control System coordinated defensive armament through analog computers while gunners operated from comfortable positions. Yamada pushed his Ki-61 to its absolute ceiling, airspeed barely 180 miles per hour, struggling in thin air near 30,000 feet. His pre-war training had not anticipated combat at such altitudes. The mission plan emphasized attacking from above and diving passes to conserve energy, but reaching position over the bombers proved impossible. Japanese doctrine developed against unescorted B-17s and B-24s at moderate altitudes was entirely inadequate. The Hien could only sustain 30,000 feet for seconds before stalling, forcing recovery that cost 3,000 feet. Repeated attempts produced similar results as engine temperatures exceeded limits and oil pressure fluctuated dangerously. Yamada watched bomber contrails pass overhead, defensive guns tracking but unable to fire at extreme range. Only 40 Japanese fighters managed any attacks that morning, most achieving single firing passes before losing energy. Machine gun rounds lost velocity rapidly at high altitude, often falling short. Few fighters reaching effective firing positions lacked energy for prolonged engagement, managing only brief bursts. Anti-aircraft shells detonated thousands of feet below the bombers despite maximum elevation. Japan's largest AA guns theoretically reached 30,000 feet, but accuracy was virtually impossible. The November 24 raid marked the first large-scale B-29 assault on Tokyo since the Doolittle raid 31 months earlier. The formation pressed toward Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino plant, Japan's primary aircraft engine facility. Chief Bombardier Lieutenant Coleman released bombs on signal, followed by others in sequence from varying altitudes. Powerful jet stream winds at over 200 miles per hour caused only 24 aircraft to hit the primary target, with others striking secondary targets or missing. The psychological impact, however, was profound. Bombs fell from unprecedented heights while Japanese fighters circled helplessly below, unable to reach the attackers. Ground observers watched vapor trails crossing Tokyo's sky at previously unimaginable altitude beyond reach of defending fighters. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka coordinates fighter operations from sector control, receiving frustrated reports from interceptor squadrons. Pilots report engines failing, controls becoming ineffective, and inability to sustain altitude necessary for interception. The bombers proceed through Japanese airspace, suffering only one loss to a ramming attack by a damaged fighter in a suicidal gesture of desperation. Defending pilots expend fuel in futile climb attempts, most returning to base without ever reaching firing range. The technological superiority displayed shocks Japanese military leadership and pilots alike. The 21st Bomber Command concludes its first Tokyo mission with minimal damage from defenses, though mechanical issues force several B-29s to divert or ditch in the Pacific. Japanese fighters claim only one confirmed victory through ramming, while bomber gunners claim 5 Japanese fighters destroyed. The altitude sanctuary contradicts every Japanese expectation based on intercepting lower-flying bombers from China bases. This operational failure stems from fundamental misunderstanding of American bomber capabilities and the revolutionary nature of the B-29's design. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Gender observes B-29 operations from Naval Headquarters, analyzing Army fighter failures with growing concern. His intelligence reports emphasize the unprecedented bomber altitude that exceeds Japanese interceptor capabilities by significant margins. Even the Navy's latest fighters cannot effectively engage at such heights. The strategic implications suggest requirements for completely new aircraft designs or alternative defensive methods, but Japan lacks time and resources for such development. The intelligence failure reflects limited technical information about American pressurization technology and turbo supercharged engines, innovations that transformed high-altitude operations. Japanese planning had assumed enemy bombers would operate at conventional altitudes below 25,000 feet based on all previous experience. The B-29's pressurized cabin concept remained poorly understood by imperial military analysts who failed to grasp its implications for combat operations. Previous American bombers operating from China bases flew at altitudes Japanese fighters could reach, reinforcing these assumptions. December 3, 1944 brings another concentrated B-29 attack against Tokyo, with 86 aircraft targeting the same Musashino plant. The Japanese response evolves based on the November experience. Captain Terahiko Kobayashi of the elite 244th Senti implements new
Tactics: positioning his fighters at maximum altitude before the bombers arrive, hoping to dive on them with energy advantage.
But even starting from optimal position, the K-61S cannot reach
bomber altitude. The formation includes specially modified interceptors with
reduced armor, removed radios, and minimal ammunition to save weight.
These
stripped fighters achieve marginally better altitude, but still fall short of effective engagement height. Lieutenant Saburo Hayashi leads a specialized ramming unit called Hagakurtai, formed from volunteer pilots
willing to sacrifice themselves.
The unit's aircraft strip all unnecessary weight, including most armament and armor protection, carrying only enough fuel for one-way missions to achieve maximum altitude.
The modified K-61 fighters climb toward the approaching formation with emergency boost engaged, accepting certain engine damage.
Manifold pressure exceeds manufacturer limits while cylinder head temperatures approach failure point.
Pilots breathe pure oxygen for 30 minutes before takeoff, but the inadequate oxygen systems still cause hypoxia symptoms during extreme altitude attempts.
Most fighters stall around 30,000 feet, still below effective
engagement altitude. Sergeant Masawaki achieves 31,500 ft in his lightened K-61 before attempting a ramming attack against a straggling B-29.
The bomber's defensive guns fire continuously as the fighter approaches from below in a zoom climb.
Multiple 50
caliber rounds strike the Ki-61, but Itaki maintains his collision course.
At
the last moment, his fighter loses energy, stalling 500 feet below target.
Before entering an uncontrollable spin,
the pilot recovers at 20,000 feet, his aircraft too damaged and lacking fuel to attempt another climb.
The ramming
attacks achieve occasional successes when bombers descend due to mechanical problems, but cannot systematically
counter the high-altitude threat. Through December 1944, B-29 losses remain minimal while Japanese cities begin suffering strategic damage. The defending pilots experience profound frustration, watching their homeland attacked while remaining powerless to intervene effectively.
Traditional samurai warrior spirit proves meaningless against technological barriers preventing combat engagement.
Pilots report feelings of helplessness
and shame at their inability to protect Japan despite willingness to sacrifice their lives.
Major General Curtis Lame assumes command of the 21st Bomber Command in January 1945.
Analyzing high-altitude daylight rate effectiveness with his characteristic intensity.
Initial missions achieve poor
accuracy due to the jetrine winds discovered at bombing altitude, sometimes exceeding 250 miles per hour. These winds, unknown before B-29 operations, push bombers rapidly across targets, making accurate bombing nearly impossible.
Navigation proves difficult. While bombs drift miles from intended targets, regardless of bombardier skill, cloud cover frequently obscures targets during winter months, forcing radar bombing with minimal precision. The combination of factors means less than 10% of bombs hit intended targets.
Lame faces pressure from Washington to produce better results.
After analyzing the
tactical situation, he implements a revolutionary change in March 1945,
ordering low-altitude night incendiary attacks against urban areas.
This decision transforms the air war over
Japan. B-29's stripped defensive armament except tail guns carrying maximum incendiary bomb loads. The altitude reduction from 30,000 feet to 5,000 to
9,000 feet eliminates the jetrine problem while bringing bombers within range of
Japanese defenses. The tactical shift means Japanese fighters can suddenly achieve effective interception altitude, fundamentally changing combat dynamics. March 9,
1945 witnesses Operation Meeting House, the devastating Tokyo firebombing mission
that reshaped strategic bombing doctrine. The attack force of 334 B-29s
approaches at 5,000 to 9,000 foot altitude, finally within reach of all
Japanese fighter types.
Night conditions and the unexpected tactical change
initially confused Japanese defenses. Lieutenant Yoshio Mitsuyoshi scrambles in his Nakajima Ki-44 from Matsuda Airfield, finally able to reach bomber altitude without difficulty. But night combat presents entirely different challenges. Without airborne
radar or effective ground control, Japanese fighters struggle to locate targets in darkness.
Searchlights
illuminate individual bombers, while anti-aircraft guns engage at point-blank range for the first time. Ki-44s and Ki-61s conduct desperate single attacks without radio
coordination or formation support. Mitsuyoshi achieves multiple firing
passes against B-29s, observing hits on engine nacelles and fuselages. Several bombers stream flames and lose altitude, but most continue to their targets despite damage.
The Superfortresses demonstrate remarkable durability, absorbing tremendous punishment while proceeding to targets. Remote-controlled turrets engage attacking fighters with radar-directed fire in darkness, proving surprisingly effective. Japanese pilots trained for daylight combat struggle with night engagement techniques.
The incendiary attack creates a firestorm consuming 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing an estimated 100,000 civilians in the deadliest air raid in history.
Japanese fighters claim 14 B-29s destroyed, the highest toll of the war, but cannot prevent catastrophic damage to the capital. Low altitude enables
interception, but overwhelming bomber numbers, night conditions, and the surprise tactical shift limit defensive
effectiveness. The success of firebombing validates Lane's gamble, establishing a pattern for subsequent raids. The tactical shift invalidates Japanese high-altitude interceptor development
programs that had been desperately pursuing solutions to the altitude problem.
Resources devoted to high-altitude engine development and pressurization research become irrelevant overnight.
Imperial Navy Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi flies the new Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden
interceptor during B-29 raids over Nagoya in early 1945. The Raiden's supercharged CAS engine enables a 36,000-foot ceiling, theoretically sufficient to engage B-29s. But combat at extreme altitude proves nearly impossible even when fighters can reach bomber height. Controls barely respond while the engine produces minimal power despite supercharging. Pilots report inability to maintain pursuit curves or lead targets effectively in the thin air, even when reaching bomber altitude. Fighters lack performance for effective engagement. The Raiden requires perfect positioning before bomber arrival to attempt even a single firing pass. Climbing pursuit from below remains impossible once bombers pass overhead. Many pilots experience oxygen system failures, causing disorientation or unconsciousness at altitude. The few successful interceptions occur against damaged stragglers descending from formation, not healthy bombers at operational altitude.
April 1945 brings coordinated kamikaze attacks against B-29 formations.
As conventional interception continues proving inadequate, the Japanese military formally organizes special attack units specifically targeting B-29s. Corporal Koshi Ogawa successfully rams B-29 Torchi over Kawasaki on April 12. Both aircraft destroyed in the collision.
The same day witnesses one of the most celebrated acts of heroism
in B-29 operations. Staff Sergeant Henry Irwin earns the Medal of Honor when a phosphorus flare explodes prematurely in his aircraft.
The device burns through Irwin's face and body, destroying his nose and blinding him.
Despite horrific injuries,
Irwin carries the flaming device through the bomber to the cockpit window, saving 11 crew members.
His sacrifice
exemplifies the courage shown by both sides despite the technological mismatch.
Special attack units format multiple bases with pilots volunteering for certain death missions against the Silver Bombers. These ramming attacks
achieve limited success, destroying perhaps 10 B-29s throughout the war, a
tiny percentage of the bomber force. The psychological impact on American crews exceeds the tactical results, knowing that enemy pilots will deliberately ram their aircraft. Yet even successful ramming attacks cannot significantly
impact the bombing campaign's effectiveness. The central fire control system on B-29s
proves remarkably effective against Japanese fighters despite reduced gun positions compared to B-17s. Computer-controlled turrets track multiple targets simultaneously while gunners operate from pressurized compartments rather than exposed positions. Japanese pilots report unprecedented defensive fire accuracy, with the automated system maintaining tracking even during evasive maneuvers. The remote control system allows continued operation despite battle damage to individual gun positions. Unlike previous bombers where gunner casualties meant defenseless arcs, this technological advantage compounds the altitude sanctuary when bombers operate at maximum ceiling. The arrival of P-51 Mustang escorts from Uoima in April 1945 further transforms the tactical situation.
These long-range fighters establish air superiority over Japan, making daylight B-29 operations even safer.
Japanese interceptors must
now contend with aggressive escort fighters while attempting bomber engagement.
The few fighters that penetrate the escort screen find themselves pursued while trying to position for bomber attacks. Captain Yasuhiko Koro commands the 64th Sentai equipped with new Nakajima Ki-84 He-8 fighters, Japan's most advanced operational fighter. The Ki-84 achieves
better altitude performance than earlier types with a service ceiling of 34,450
ft under ideal conditions.
Maximum sustained altitude reaches about
32,000 feet with reduced armament and minimal fuel load. Pilots report adequate performance up to 28,000 feet before dramatic power degradation occurs. The HAR-45 engine, though powerful at medium altitudes, lacks effective supercharging for extreme height. Ki-84's attempt intercepting mining missions where B-29s operate at reduced altitude over water, achieving
several victories against bombers below 20,000 feet. These successes demonstrate
the fighter's capability when altitude disadvantage is removed, but higher altitude daylight missions remain largely immune from interception despite Ki-84 improvements.
The performance gap persists throughout remaining combat operations, with most Ki-84 sorties failing to reach engagement.
Altitude. June 1945 introduces the Kawasaki K-100,
a fighter converted from Ki-61 airframes with radial engines, replacing the troublesome liquid-cooled power
plants.
The modification improves reliability dramatically, but reduces
altitude performance compared to inline engine versions. Ki-100s excel
against American fighters at medium altitude, proving highly maneuverable and well-liked by pilots, but the radial
engine lacks high-altitude capability, limiting ceiling to around 32,000 feet.
Pilots report superior handling characteristics, but insufficient altitude performance for B-29.
Interception. The Ki-100 represents Japan's best operational fighter, but arrives too late and in insufficient numbers. Japanese aircraft industry produces
various specialized high-altitude interceptor prototypes throughout 1945. The Mitsubishi Ki-83 twin-engine fighter promises exceptional altitude performance with turbo-supercharged
engines. The Kawasaki K-102 heavy fighter carries powerful armament specifically for bomber destruction.
Development programs suffer from material shortages,
particularly high-grade aluminum and special alloys needed for superchargers. Manufacturing difficulties prevent operational deployment before war's end, with most prototypes destroyed in bombing raids. B-29 attacks systematically destroy aircraft factories and engine plants, eliminating production capability. The Akashi engine works, producing the HAR-40 engine for Ki-61 fighters burns in January 1945. The technological gap widens as American improvements outpace Japanese development efforts with each month, bringing enhanced B-29 capabilities while Japanese industry collapses. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets leads special training for atomic bomb delivery, taking advantage of B-29 altitude capability. The Silverplate B-29 strip all defensive armament except tail guns, achieving even higher operational altitudes.
These modifications ensure nuclear
delivery aircraft remain completely immune from interception. August 6, 1945 brings the ultimate demonstration of altitude sanctuary. When Enola Gay approaches Hiroshima at 3160 feet, Japanese fighters launch from
nearby bases, but cannot reach the lone bombers' altitude.
Lieutenant Matsuo Yasui climbs desperately in his Ki-61.
Struggling to reach the enemy, his fighter achieves 29,000 feet before stalling, still 2,000 feet below the bomber.
Other interceptors fare no
better, with most failing to exceed 27,000 feet despite perfect weather conditions.
The atomic explosion occurs while fighters circle helplessly below, unable to intervene or even identify the special nature of the weapon. Similar failure occurs August 9 when Boxcar delivers the second atomic weapon over Nagasaki. Japanese radar tracks the bomber
throughout its approach, providing ample warning for interception attempts.
Multiple fighter squadrons launch but cannot reach the B-29's altitude of 28,000 feet, the technological sanctuary. Enable strategic weapons employment without any possibility of prevention. Post-war analysis reveals the full extent of Japanese technological disadvantage against B-29 operations.
Pressurization technology enabled sustained operations above Japanese interceptor capability throughout the
campaign. American crews worked efficiently at altitudes where Japanese pilots could barely survive. Engine turbo supercharging maintained power at altitudes where Japanese engines produced less than half their rated output.
The accumulated advantages proved absolutely decisive in strategic
bombing effectiveness.
Japanese pilots consistently demonstrated remarkable courage and
skill within the mechanical limitations of their aircraft. Individual determination could not overcome fundamental technological disparities in equipment capability.
High-altitude combat required engineering solutions beyond Japanese industrial capacity during wartime conditions. Material shortages, particularly special steels and aluminum alloys, prevented
development of competitive systems. The B-29 campaign validated American investment in advanced bomber technology and industrial capacity. Strategic bombing effectiveness depended
on achieving operational sanctuary through altitude advantage that no amount of enemy courage could overcome.
Japanese defensive failures demonstrated the importance of matching enemy technological capabilities in modern warfare.
The campaign influenced post-war military aviation development priorities
worldwide, establishing precedents still relevant today. General Kurichika Anime
evaluates home defense failures during final military conferences before surrender.
B-29 altitude superiority negated Japan's geographic advantages and fighting spirit completely.
Technical inferiority proved insurmountable despite tactical innovation and pilot sacrifice.
The
recognition of technological defeat influenced military acceptance of unconditional surrender terms.
Without
the ability to defend against B-29s, continuing resistance became meaningless.
Former K-61 pilot Lieutenant Naoshi Kano recalls desperate interception attempts in post-war memoirs.
"We climbed with everything our engines could give, watching the temperature gauges go into the red zone.
My flight
leader's engine caught fire at 28,000 feet. He bailed out while I continued climbing, reaching perhaps 30,000 feet before my controls became completely ineffective.
The B-29s passed overhead like silver ghosts, unreachable despite our most desperate efforts.
The frustration and shame of being unable to protect our homeland haunted us more than fear of
death."
B-29 crew member Technical Sergeant Robert Johnson describes observing Japanese fighters from his central fire control position.
"We could see them struggling up toward us, tiny specks getting larger slowly.
Sometimes they'd get close enough that we could see details, the red circles on their wings, even the pilot's canopy. Then they'd stall and fall away, tumbling like leaves. A few managed to fire at us, but their rounds usually
fell short.
It was almost sad watching them try so hard and fail.
We had every advantage: altitude, speed, firepower, armor.
They had nothing but courage.
And courage wasn't enough against physics." Strategic Air Command incorporates B-29 operational lessons into Cold War nuclear delivery doctrine. High altitude penetration becomes fundamental principle for strategic bomber employment against defended targets.
Pressurization and supercharging technology advance rapidly based on combat experience over Japan.
The
tactical advantages demonstrated against Japanese defenses influenced decades of bomber development, leading eventually to jet-powered strategic bombers operating at even more extreme altitudes. Japanese aviation industry studies B-29 technology through captured aircraft and
documentation after surrender. Engineers recognize multiple technological generations separate Japanese and American aircraft design philosophy. Pressurization systems incorporate complex sealing mechanisms and structural reinforcement beyond Japanese manufacturing capability.
Turbo supercharging represents precision engineering requiring special materials and manufacturing tolerances unavailable
in wartime Japan. Remote control defensive systems employ analog computers more advanced than any Japanese military equipment using vacuum tubes and precision components Japan could not produce. The technological examination provides sobering assessment
of industrial development requirements for modern aviation competition.
Veteran
B-29 pilot Colonel Paul Tibbets reflects on altitude advantage during atomic missions. Flying above enemy fighter capability enabled precise navigation to target. Without defensive concerns, we knew Japanese fighters couldn't reach us, which allowed complete focus on the mission. The technological sanctuary proved absolute. They could see us, track us on radar, but couldn't touch us. It was like being behind bulletproof glass. Their inability to intercept guaranteed atomic mission success regardless of early warning or preparation. Ki-84 pilot Captain Iwa Hayashi describes attempting B-29 interception during war's final months. Despite flying Japan's most advanced fighter, reaching bomber altitude remained nearly impossible. The engine would cough and sputter above 30,000 feet, barely producing enough power to maintain flight. Controls became mushy like flying through molasses. We'd make one pass if lucky, firing a short burst before stalling, watching them continue unharmed while our cities burned below created a sense of helplessness I'll never forget. Analysis of crashed B-29s reveals sophisticated construction exceeding Japanese manufacturing capabilities entirely. Pressurized compartment design incorporates complex sealing systems using synthetic rubber compounds Japan could not produce. Structural reinforcement for pressurization requires precision welding techniques and quality control beyond Japanese standards. Remote turret control systems employ analog computers using vacuum tube technology more advanced than any Japanese military equipment. The servo mechanisms for gun control demonstrate precision manufacturing unavailable in Japanese industry. Even basic components, like electrical wiring, use materials and insulation superior to Japanese equivalents. Major Toshio Sakagawa commands the 244th Sentai during B-29 offensive, recording unit combat experiences. My pilots were among Japan's best with years of combat experience, yet we achieved virtually nothing against B-29s at altitude. Our combat reports consistently described the same failure. Climbing desperately, reaching perhaps 28,000 or 29,000 feet, engines failing, controls becoming ineffective, then watching helplessly as bombers passed overhead. The technological defeat was complete and humiliating. B-29 Bombardier Lieutenant Marcus McDilder observes Japanese fighter attempts during missions over Osaka. The Japanese pilots showed incredible determination. We'd watch them climbing toward us for 15 or 20 minutes, struggling higher and higher. Some would try zoom climbs, trading speed for altitude in desperate attempts to reach us. They'd fire a few rounds, usually falling short, then stall and spin away. Our gunners rarely needed to fire. The altitude was better protection than any armor or weapons. It was a completely one-sided fight determined by technology, not courage. Japanese military attach reports from Germany describe Luftwaffe difficulties intercepting high-altitude Allied bombers, providing context for Japan's struggles. Even with superior engines and technology, German fighters faced challenges engaging bombers above 25,000 feet. Mi-262 jet fighters achieve limited success through speed and altitude performance advantages unavailable to Japan. Japanese industry cannot develop equivalent jet technology before war's end. Despite recognizing the requirement, attempts to copy German designs fail due to lack of special materials and manufacturing expertise. The technological gap proves unbridgeable given resource limitations and strategic bombing damage to industry. Colonel John Montgomery leads the 9th Bombardment Group missions from Tinian, observing Japanese defensive evolution. Initially, they tried mass interceptions, sending up everything that could fly. By spring 1945, they'd largely given up on daylight high altitude interceptions. They concentrated on night raids when we came in low within centuries. Smart adaptation, but too late to matter. The altitude advantage we enjoyed for most of the campaign meant we could destroy their industry almost unopposed. Maintenance officer Captain Hiroshi Fujiwara documents chronic problems with Japanese high-altitude fighter operations in technical reports. Engine failures increased exponentially during maximum altitude attempts. The HAR-40 engine in Ki-61s would overheat. Within minutes at full throttle above 25,000 feet, oil pressure dropped.
Coolant
boiled despite radiator modifications. Oxygen system malfunctions caused
numerous pilot casualties.
Men passing out at altitude, some never recovering.
Consciousness
Frostbite became common as pilots removed gloves to manipulate
controls at extreme altitude.
The cumulative mechanical failures made sustained high-altitude operations
impossible regardless of pilot determination. B-29 Engineer Staff Sergeant James
Pearson monitors pressurization systems during combat missions.
The cabin
Altitude stayed at a comfortable 8,000 foot equivalent while we cruised above 30,000.
We worked in shirt sleeves, moving freely between stations.
Meanwhile, Japanese pilots were struggling with frozen controls,
inadequate oxygen, and engines that could barely function. The technological mismatch was absolute. It wasn't a fair fight. It was barely a fight at all. Japanese radar operator Corporal Shigo Yamamoto tracks B-29 formations approaching at unprecedented altitude.
Our equipment could track them from hundreds of miles away, giving our fighters plenty of warning.
But warning
meant nothing when our planes couldn't reach bombing altitude.
I'd vector fighters toward intercept points, knowing they'd fail. Pilots would report maximum altitude achieved, usually
27,000 or 28,000 feet, then watch bombers pass overhead at 31,000. The frustration in their voices was heartbreaking. We had the will, but not the means. Final Japanese military assessments acknowledge complete failure defending against B-29 high-altitude operations. Despite geographic advantages, warrior spirit, and early warning capabilities, technological inferiority prevented effective homeland defense.
Industrial capacity limitations made matching American bomber technology impossible during wartime. The recognition of
technological defeat influenced military support for surrender negotiations, acknowledging that continuing resistance
could not prevent Japan's destruction from the air. Lieutenant Kunio Tanaka flies final interception sortie August 14, 1945 against reconnaissance B-29.
Conducting damage assessment photography, his Ki-100 fighter achieves 28,000 feet before engine power.
Loss forces descent typical of hundreds of failed interceptions. The photo.
Reconnaissance aircraft proceeds unmolested at 35,000 feet, documenting
atomic bomb damage for American intelligence. The mission symbolizes continuing technological inability to counter American strategic aviation superiority, even in war's final hours. B-29 radio operator Sergeant William A.E.L. monitors Japanese fighter control frequencies during missions, providing insight into enemy frustration. We could hear their ground controllers vectoring fighters toward us, giving altitude and heading information. Then the pilots would report they couldn't climb any higher, engines overheating, losing power. Sometimes you'd hear anger, sometimes resignation.
They knew where we were, knew what we were doing, but couldn't stop us.
Technology determined everything. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducts extensive analysis of Japanese fighter effectiveness against B-29 operations. High-altitude daylight raids suffered
minimal losses to fighter interception throughout the campaign. Approximately 50 B-29s lost to fighters from over 30,000 individual sorties, a loss rate of less than 0.2%. Japanese fighters proved effective only when B-29s operated at reduced altitude
due to mechanical problems or tactical requirements. The statistics validate altitude
sanctuary effectiveness against contemporary interceptor technology.
Former Imperial Japanese Navy commander
Masateko Kumiya evaluates strategic bombing defense failures in post-war
analysis. The B-29's altitude capability exceeded our intelligence estimates by
at least 5,000 feet. We expected maximum operating altitudes around 26,000 feet,
based on B-17 and B-24 performance,
when they routinely operated above 30,000 feet.
Our entire defensive strategy collapsed. We lacked time, resources, and
technology to develop effective countermeasures. B-29 pilot Colonel Robert Robbins describes the psychological advantage of altitude sanctuary.
Knowing enemy fighters couldn't reach us changed everything.
We flew straight and level to targets.
No evasive maneuvering needed. Bombarders had stable platforms for accurate sighting. Crews stayed calm. knowing the main threat came from mechanical problems, not enemy action.
The confidence boost was enormous.
We owned the sky above 30,000 feet and everyone knew it. Kai 44.
Veteran Captain Yoshiro Aoki recalls watching B-29 contrails beyond reach.
Each mission brought the same humiliation. We'd climb until our engines failed, achieve maybe one-third the altitude needed, then watch silver contrails drawing lines across our sky. Traditional warrior spirit meant nothing against aluminum and engineering.
We were samurai with swords trying to reach
the moon.
The psychological impact destroyed morale more than combat losses ever could.
General Henry Arnold evaluates B-29 program success despite enormous development costs exceeding the Manhattan Project.
The strategic bombing campaign validated every dollar invested
in advanced technology.
The altitude sanctuary enabled precision attacks and
atomic weapon delivery without prohibitive losses. We proved that technological superiority could
determine victory without massive ground invasions.
The investment in pressurization,
supercharging, and defensive systems paid dividends that shaped military aviation for decades. Japanese aircraft designer Teo Doi analyzes key 61 limitations against B-29
operations.
Our fighter was optimized for combat between 15,000 and 25,000 feet, where most aerial combat occurred. We never anticipated bombers operating routinely above 30,000 feet. Modifying existing designs proved impossible. The engine, airframe, and systems were fundamentally inadequate for extreme altitude. Starting fresh would require years we didn't have and resources that
no longer existed. Squadron leader Major Terahiko Kobayashi's 244th Centi
achieved over 100 victories against American aircraft, but minimal success against B-29s. My pilots included multiple aces with years of experience against fighters and
medium bombers.
We remained competitive, but B-29s at altitude might as well have
been on another planet. Skill became irrelevant when your aircraft cannot physically reach the enemy. We watched our homeland burn while possessing the will, but not the means to defend it.
B-29 navigator Lieutenant Thomas Cartwright describes the navigation advantages of
pressurized operations. Working at altitude without oxygen masks or heavy gloves meant precise chart work and calculations. We could use all our instruments effectively, communicate clearly, move between stations as needed. Japanese navigators and unpressurized fighters dealt with fogged
goggles, frozen instruments, and hypoxia affecting judgment.
Our technological
advantages multiplied effectiveness in ways beyond simple altitude.
Japanese
anti-aircraft artillery commander Colonel Hiroshi Yamamoto documents the futility of ground-based defenses.
Our
largest guns could theoretically reach 30,000 feet, but accuracy at that altitude was nearly impossible.
Shell dispersion patterns meant hitting anything required incredible luck. We fired thousands of
rounds per bomber destroyed, depleting ammunition reserves without meaningful effect.
The B-29s flew above effective ground defense capability, protected by altitude as effectively as any armor.
Maintenance challenges plagued Japanese high-altitude operations throughout the campaign.
Engines require complete overhaul after just a few maximum altitude attempts due to excessive stress. Supercharger systems fail regularly with replacement parts increasingly unavailable. Oxygen systems need constant maintenance.
While suffering from inadequate supplies of oxygen bottles and calcium hydroxide for CO2 absorption,
the mechanical
attrition reduces available interceptors regardless of combat losses, creating a
downward spiral of capability. B-29 tail gunner Sergeant Robert Goldsborough observes Japanese fighter attempts from his isolated position.
From the tail, I had the best view of Japanese fighters trying to reach us.
They'd appear as specks slowly growing
larger as they climbed. Some would fire from extreme range, their traces arcing
up but falling short.
Others would try zoom climbs, trading all their speed for
altitude.
They'd hang motionless for a moment, almost reaching us, then stall
and tumble away. I rarely fired. They never got close enough to be a real threat. The technological mismatch extends beyond simple altitude to every aspect of aerial warfare.
B-29s carry sophisticated navigation
equipment, including radar and radio navigation aids unavailable to Japanese forces. Communication systems allow
coordinated operations across hundreds of miles, while Japanese radios frequently fail. Even basic equipment, like heated flight suits and optical gun sights, demonstrate American industrial superiority.
Japanese industrial mobilization cannot match American production capability despite desperate efforts. B-29
manufacturing incorporates precision techniques and quality control beyond Japanese capability. Assembly line production achieves economies of scale impossible with Japanese cottage industry methods. America produces nearly 4,000 B-29s while Japan struggles to manufacture hundreds of inferior fighters.
Attempts to replicate captured equipment fail due to material science limitations. Japan lacks access to special alloys,
synthetic materials, and precision manufacturing tools required for advanced aviation technology.
The industrial technology gap proves insurmountable given wartime constraints and resource availability. Lieutenant Commander Masahiko Kawamoto leads special attack units against B-29 formations over Nagoya. We modified our tactics constantly, trying everything imaginable. Night attacks, dawn interceptions, coordinated ramming attempts. Nothing worked consistently. The B-29s adapted faster than we could, changing altitudes, routes, and tactics. When we finally developed techniques for night interception, they switched back to high-altitude daylight raids we couldn't reach. They held every advantage while we only had determination. Boeing engineers designed the B-29
specifically for Pacific Theater strategic bombing requirements against Japan.
Extended range enables operations
from distant bases beyond enemy interdiction capability.
Pressurization permits routine operations at altitudes surpassing enemy interceptor capabilities. Defensive systems offer protection without compromising performance.
The design philosophy emphasizes technological edge over conventional bomber traits, creating a weapons platform rather than merely an aircraft.
Post-war aviation development integrates lessons from B-29 missions extensively.
Pressurization becomes standard in commercial aviation, directly adapted from military innovations. Turbo supercharging allows routine high-altitude flight for all types of aircraft.
Remote control systems evolve into modern fly-by-wire technology.
These technological advancements reshape aviation beyond military uses, laying the groundwork for the contemporary aerospace industry.
Captain Kazunota leads the 84th Squadron during the final homeland defense operations.
Japan's most advanced fighter proved ineffective against B-29s at extreme altitudes.
Below 25,000 feet, we could engage successfully. Above that, we were powerless.
Pilots returned from missions demoralized, often without firing a single shot.
The psychological toll outweighed aircraft losses. We recognized we were technologically outmatched, which equated to total defeat. The B-29 operations validated American strategic bombing doctrine through demonstration of technological supremacy. Altitude sanctuary allowed systematic destruction of Japanese military-industrial infrastructure without excessive losses. Strategic effects were achieved without invasion, confirming airpower theories. Atomic weapon delivery succeeded thanks to operational immunity from interception.
The campaign demonstrated decisive application of airpower via technological advantage rather than sheer numbers, setting precedents for Cold War deterrence strategies.
Japanese military leaders realized the implications of technological defeat on continued warfare.
Their inability to counter B-29s reflected broader technological inferiority across all military domains.
Industrial capacity could not rival American production while enduring continuous strategic bombing.
This cumulative understanding influenced Emperor Hirohito's decision to accept unconditional surrender, recognizing continued resistance would be futile. Veteran B-29 crew member, Chief Master Sergeant Frank Morrison, maintained aircraft systems throughout the Pacific campaign.
The pressurization apparatus was complex but reliable with proper upkeep. Turbo superchargers demanded careful management but provided power at altitudes where Japanese engines struggled. Every system represented decades of engineering expertise and industrial capability Japan lacked.
Victory came through technology and industrial might, not just valor. Former Ki-61 pilot Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka survived multiple failed interception attempts against B-29s. Each sortie demanded maximal physical effort coping with high-altitude effects. Breathing was difficult even with oxygen, hands went numb from cold, eyes streamed constantly from dry air and extreme chill. Watching bombers operate unchallenged while Japanese cities burned inflicted psychological trauma beyond combat stress. We felt we had failed our ancestors, our emperor, and our people, not due to lack of effort, but due to technological inadequacy. American industrial mobilization produced equipment in quantities and quality beyond Japanese comprehension. The B-29 program alone cost more than Japan's entire wartime aviation budget. Mass production enabled economies of scale unattainable by Japanese methods. Precision tools and rigorous quality control ensured consistent performance unavailable to Japanese industry. This industrial disparity amplified technological advantages throughout the strategic bombing campaign. General Curtis LeMay's tactical innovations maximized B-29 advantages against Japanese defenses. Low-altitude night raids negated altitude advantage but exploited other technological strengths. Radar bombing, incendiary ordnance, and mass formations overwhelmed Japanese capabilities regardless of altitude. The flexibility to adapt tactics while retaining technological superiority proved decisive. Japanese adaptation could not overcome fundamental deficiencies in equipment and industrial capacity. The B-29 campaign transformed understanding of strategic airpower application. Technology allowed outcomes previously requiring massive ground forces. Industrial capacity became as crucial as military strategy in modern warfare. These precedents influenced military planning through the Cold War and beyond. Nuclear deterrence strategies were built directly on B-29 operational experience over Japan. Analysis of Japanese fighter operations against B-29 raids underscores technology's decisive role in modern warfare. Despite extraordinary courage, tactical ingenuity, and desperate sacrifice, Japanese pilots could not surmount fundamental technological limitations. The altitude sanctuary provided by pressurization and turbo supercharging created an insurmountable advantage. Coupled with America's industrial capacity for mass-producing advanced weapon systems, the technological gap was unbridgeable. The B-29's operational superiority over Japan validated American investment in advanced aviation technology, demonstrating that in modern warfare, technological advantage can outweigh traditional military virtues like courage, skill, and determination. The campaign's outcome was forged as much in American factories and engineering offices as in the skies over Japan, setting standards that shaped military aviation development for generations.